Hi, I'm Susanna and today I'm talking about my 10 favorite books I read in 2025. Let's start with my favorite book. This was also the first novel I finished last year. This is Naomi Alderman's dystopian fiction, The Power, and here's what I had to say about it in my January reading wrap-up. All around the world, teenage girls discover that they have a power to hurt, even to kill. And what's more, they can wake up this skill in older women. This power turns the world on its head, with men realizing they have lost control. The day of the girls has arrived. The Power is a thought-provoking and uncomfortable, at times even disturbing dystopian fiction about what might happen if women suddenly gained the ability to inflict pain to others. In the book, this happens through the development of tissue between the collarbones that conducts electricity. The novel is a thought experiment of what might happen next, whether having women in charge really would result in a kinder, more caring world, like many would say. The story is told from 4 main points of view. I liked how these 4 points of view showed how different groups of people and institutions, criminals, politicians, journalists and media and religions, would react to the new reality. However, all 4 main characters are in some way extraordinary, whether in the amount of power they have or the way they are willing to exploit the situation. There are no ordinary people trying to cope with the new reality. There are no women with so-called regular fathers, brothers, husbands and sons whom they love and try to protect. The picture this book gives of the powerful women is extremely bleak. Having a female point of view character who protects men would have offered a more nuanced picture of how women might react, but then I guess this wouldn't be a dystopian anymore. The Power imagines what the world would be like if men had to live in constant fear of their physical safety. The most harrowing thing is that the things that the women in this book do to men are things that have happened and are happening to women in the world right now. I would like to think the women in power would be kinder, gentler and more caring, but I admit that that might be too idealistic. Alderman shows that power corrupts and that men and women are both equally capable of using it to hurt others. This book doesn't give easy answers. Instead, it leaves you with a question. How would you use the power if it was given to you? This was definitely a 5-star read and I would highly recommend it to everyone. It's not an easy book by any means, but it stays with you and hopefully inspires you to build a better world. My second favorite was the last novel I finished last year. This is Jacqueline Harpman's dystopian fiction, I Who Have Never Known Men. Here's what I had to say about it in my December wrap-up. In an underground bunker, 39 women and a young girl are imprisoned in a cage, their every move watched over by guards. As the girl cannot remember life before the imprisonment, the women treat her as an outcast. Until one day, a siren goes off, the guards run away, and a stroke of luck gives the women a chance to escape. In the strange and desolate world above, the girl shows herself to be the key to the others' survival. I Who Have Never Known Men is Jacqueline Harpman's dystopian fiction set in a post-apocalyptic world and an instant 5-star read for me. Originally published in French in 1995, this book has found new success in recent years and its popularity does not surprise me. This was a gripping and thought-provoking novel. With less than 200 pages, I Who Have Never Known Men is a fast read, but it is introspective rather than action-packed story. The plot of the novel is simple. The main character and the women she's been imprisoned with have lived in an underground bunker for years. The only excitement offered to them is a daily discussion on how to boil their meager rations of meat and vegetables. When they finally escape the prison, they encounter a strange planet that may not be Earth. A world with nothing but plains and hills and occasional rivers, unchanging seasons and bunker after bunker with dead prisoners, both women and men. The nameless main character doesn't remember anything about the life before, the life the women consider as normal with menial jobs, husbands and children. This makes her an outcast but also gives her an advantage. Since she has not experienced any other way of living, she can adapt to the new reality more easily than the women with their vague memories of the life before imprisonment. It's impossible to read this book without noting the author's background as a Jewish woman who escaped the Nazi occupation of Belgium during the Second World War. The senseless imprisonment and human cruelty remind one of the concentration camps and the Holocaust. Even after the women escape, they continue to be prisoners in this strange world. They are forced to utilize the commodities and food offered in the other bunkers. What is the surreal world they live in? Who imprisoned them and why? If you want a novel that answers all of the questions it raises, this book will frustrate you. Personally, I found that a good thing. Sometimes you need novels that only give you questions and no answers. I Who Have Never Known Men is a puzzle that refuses to be solved, leaving you with a long-lasting impression. This short but impactful novel deserves 5 stars, if not more. My third favorite was Madeline Miller's historical fantasy, Circe. Circe is not like her parents, the terrifying sun god Helios and the alluring nymph Perse. Slighted by other titans, including her own family, she seeks the companionship of mortals instead and discovers she has a dark power of her own. When she turns her witchcraft against her own kind, Zeus banishes her to a deserted island where she hones her craft and tames wild beasts. But even banishment doesn't stop her from crossing paths with many famous figures, including the beastly Minotaur, the sorceress Medea, and wily Odysseus. Circe is a retelling of the ancient Greek myth of the powerful witch Circe, who transformed men into swine until she was bested by Odysseus in Homer's The Odyssey. I loved Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles when I read it a few years ago, and I was excited to read her second novel. It wasn't quite the emotional ride that The Song of Achilles offered, but I still loved this book. Miller's writing style is ornate and flowery, and I can see that not everyone is going to love it. However, I did not find Circe quite as flowery as The Song of Achilles, which at times verged towards purple prose. The tiny problem I did have with this book was how naive Circe was. Obviously, the divine timescale is different, and even after millennia, Circe would have been little more than adolescent, but I found her constant credulity grating. I also did not like how this book, like so many other stories about women, used sexual violence as a plot point. Having a rape be the cause of Circe's revenge rampage was predictable, and I would have preferred a more innovative backstory. But all in all, the gripes I have with this book are very minor. Circe's character growth was fascinating to read about, and I found the ending moving and poignant. It wasn't as big of a tearjerker as the ending of The Song of Achilles, but Miller certainly knows how to write a touching ending. If you love feminist retellings of ancient myths, definitely read this book. I gave it full 5 stars. My next favorite book was Lauren Groff's historical fiction, The Vaster Wilds. Virginia, 1600s. In the last days of winter, a servant girl escapes from a famished and disease-ridden colonial settlement of Jamestown into wilderness. Carrying only her wits and a few possessions, she attempts to travel north to the safety of another colony. But in the vast wilderness around her, threats loom behind every tree. Hostile men, hungry animals, and the forest itself. This was an amazing read. The writing is lyrical and poetic, and the mostly nameless main character is a strong and determined female lead. It took me some time to orient myself to the narrative, and I was especially confused about the main character's age. She was called a girl throughout the novel, and it wasn't until toward the latter half of the novel when it was revealed that she was at least 16 years old, possibly 17 or 18. At first I had expected her to be a couple of years younger, but it makes sense that she was called a girl considering her status as a servant. Throughout the book we learn her backstory as a servant and a companion to her mistress's disabled daughter, as well as her short-lived love affair with a Dutch sailor during the voyage across the Atlantic and her experiences in the colony. Her life has been a series of hardships, and her escape doesn't make her life easier. The book is full of visceral and at times disturbing descriptions of starvation, sexual abuse, and human cruelty. That makes The Vaster Wilds a dark and depressing read. I wouldn't recommend it if you're not a fan of dystopian-esque literature, or if you're squeamish about descriptions of excrement and eating practically anything edible. I also wouldn't recommend this book if you want more plot and action. The main storyline of the girl's escape and running away didn't have much development and was a little repetitive. But if you love historical fiction with lyrical prose, definitely read this book. I gave it full 5 stars. The next book was also a historical fiction, Marjan Kamali's The Lion Women of Tehran. 7-year-old Elaleh Elli Soltani's comfortable middle-class life is upended by the unexpected death of her father when she and her mother are forced to move to a poorer neighborhood. In school, she meets Homa Rosbach and the 2 girls become best friends to Ellie's mother's dismay. Together, they play games and dream of becoming lion women of the first generation of working women in Iran. Opportunity allows Ellie to return to her earlier lifestyle, and memories of Homa fade until years later Homa suddenly reappears in her life. The Lion Women of Tehran is a historical fiction by Marjan Kamali. Told mostly from Ellie's point of view with a few chapters from Homa's perspective, this coming-of-age story follows the 2 Iranian girls from the early 1950s when Iran was modernizing to the early 1980s and the aftermath of Islamic Revolution. Ellie and Homa become friends at school, but after a few years of friendship, they lose touch with each other. When they meet again at 17, Ellie has become a bit of a mean girl, beautiful and popular. I expected there to be a lot more tension and conflict when the 2 main characters met again. But instead, Homa simply hugs Ellie and they become friends like they used to be. On the one hand, I liked how their friendship was portrayed, but on the other hand, I felt that Ellie's jealousy of Homa was never fully explored. I also didn't find it believable that during the 7 or so years that Ellie and Homa were not in contact, someone as extroverted and friendly as Homa didn't develop friendships with any other girls. She simply drops into Ellie's life as if nothing had happened in the years between. I'm also not sure that this book followed the right main character. Homa was the more active and driven person, although she didn't have much personality aside from being a loyal friend and a fierce activist. Ellie, on the other hand, was more passive and quite naive and self-centered. She didn't have much character development either, at least not during the main narrative. It seems that whatever development she had, it happened between the penultimate chapter and the epilogue. Speaking of the epilogue, I understand that the author wanted to add a reference to the Mahsa Amini protests that started while she was writing this book. But the listing of events that happened to the main characters between 1982 and 2022 was rather boring. It also wasn't the most organic way of presenting the information. I doubt that anyone would write a letter like that. I may have expected a book about a woman who resists both Iran's monarchy and the Islamic Revolution to have more drama and conflict, but this was a rather quiet read. The writing style is rather simple, and quite often the only insight we got into the characters were the clothes they were wearing. But despite the few minor flaws that prevented this book from being a more interesting read, I enjoyed this book a lot. I loved the constancy of the main character's friendship, and this is definitely a historical women's fiction worth reading. After some hesitation over how to rate this book, I ended up giving it 5 stars. Another book by Madeline Miller made my list of favorite reads as well. That was her short story Galatea. This short book retells the myth of the sculptor Pygmalion and his statue come to life, Galatea. The short story is based on Ovid's Metamorphoses, which narrates several ancient myths where people become animals or plants, or as in the case of this myth, an inanimate object comes to life. In Ovid's version, sculptor Pygmalion is horrified by shameless prostitutes and instead carves himself a woman from ivory, making her more perfect than any woman can be. He falls in love with his creation, and after many prayers, the goddess Venus brings the statue to life. Ovid's version seems to indicate that the couple lives happily ever after. This myth has been adapted many times from My Fair Lady to Pretty Woman, usually casting the story as a romance. Miller, on the contrary, explores the misogynistic implications of Ovid's narrative. In Ovid's story, the only good woman is sexually quote-unquote pure and physically flawless and as white as ivory. Ovid doesn't even mention her name, and Miller takes the name Galatea from other versions of the myth. Miller's story gives the voice to Galatea herself. She's locked in a sick room and kept under the guard of a nurse and a doctor who insist that she must lie still. If she disobeys their commands, they give her a medicine that makes her unconscious, unless obviously it's the day when her husband is coming to visit her. In Miller's version, the sculptor remains nameless and the only named characters are women. Although, to be fair, Galatea's name is not mentioned in the text either. This short story is a fast read and it only took me about an hour to finish, but it packs an emotional punch. Galatea was a lovely short story about a determinate and resourceful woman, and I highly recommend it to fans of historical fantasy. Again, I gave this 5 stars. In my opinion, a list of favorite reads is not complete without a classic. This is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Edmond Dantes, a 19-year-old sailor, is falsely accused of treason and imprisoned without a trial. A fellow prisoner deduces that the people responsible for Edmund's imprisonment are his romantic rival, an envious crewmate, and an ambitious magistrate who is desperate to protect his career. Edmund escapes the prison, finds the treasure his fellow prisoner told him about, and enters the 1830s Parisian society to avenge himself as the mysterious Count of Monte Cristo. This book first appeared in serialized form from 1844 to 1846 and was published in book form in 1846. This was a fun book and a classic I highly recommend. The only thing I knew about this book in advance is that there's a prison break. For some reason I thought that it would take place much later in the book, so the beginning of this book felt very fast-paced, especially for a classic. However, after the prison break the story slowed down. There's a big time jump where the narrative skips a decade and we come back to find Edmund as the Count of Monte Cristo. The part of the book that took place in Rome was where my interest in the book wavered. However, once the Count moved to Paris, things picked up again, and it was interesting to see how the Count's long con against the 3 villains played out. The ending, however, felt rushed. The Count finally realizes that he has gone too far in his desire for revenge, but we don't see much of how this realization affects him. I would have liked the story to dwell on it a bit longer. The relationship between the Count and his ward Heidi was also resolved fast, and the age difference between them rubbed me the wrong way. He must have been at least twice her age. Regardless, this is a great classic and well worth reading. I also highly recommend this unabridged translation by Robin Buss. This was a 5-star read for me. Next in the list is another historical fantasy, R.F. Kuang's Babel. Robin Swift, an orphaned Chinese boy, is brought to London by his new mysterious ward, Professor Lovell. After training years in Latin, Ancient Greek and Chinese, he enrolls in Oxford University's prestigious Royal Institute of Translation, also known as Babel. Besides being the world's center for translation, it is also the center for silverworking, a magical way of manifesting the meanings lost in translation. This makes Babel the principal assistant in the British Empire's quest for colonization. As a Chinese man raised in Britain, Robin soon realizes that serving Babel means betraying his motherland. But can a student stand against an empire? Babel is a dark academia historical fantasy about colonialism, oppression, and colonial resistance. The themes this book tackles are hugely important. Kuang does a great job exploring the complex intersecting identities of her main characters. Unfortunately, this is one of those books where I feel that the literary merit of the book is higher than my enjoyment of it. There were parts of this book that I loved. They were mostly the parts that were more fast-paced and where Robin and his friends were actively doing stuff. But there were also large sections in this book where almost nothing happened. In those parts, the main characters were just lectured to about translation theory and etymology. And I'm someone who loves translation theory and etymology. However, the exposition sections of this book dragged on too long and I didn't feel like I was learning anything new. Babel uses an omniscient third-person narration which is mostly focalized through Robin's eyes, but we never get deep insight into Robin. When he changes from a diffident boy willing to take a beating into a vengeful revolutionary who wants to destroy the British Empire, I found myself wanting more explicit character motivation. I understand why this change might happen, but it didn't feel inevitable and organic for Robin's character. Another thing that I found jarring in the choice of narration was that several times the reader was told what had happened before the event was described in detail. The narrator also resorted to countless explanations, often in footnotes, on how the obviously racist actions and expressions were, in fact, racist. That made the exploration of themes of racism and colonialism rather repetitive and heavy-handed. I also found the fantasy world building very shallow. The fantasy in this book was limited to silverworking. Silverwork is a practice where translators working in Babel engrave words in different languages in silver bars. That gives the bars magical abilities that, for example, make ships travel faster. However, the fantasy element felt superfluous. It's mentioned that silverworking was invented in the Roman Empire, and yet we're supposed to believe that it had no impact on world history until the early 19th century. It seemed that the fantasy world of Babel was exactly the same after 2000 years of silverworking as our world is or was without it. Because the fantasy elements are so shallow, the same story could have been told without any silverwork. I might have enjoyed this book more if it had been a purely alternative historical fiction, or if the fantasy elements had influenced the world more. For literary merit, I think this book deserves 5 stars, but if I rate it purely on my enjoyment of it, I'd give it 4 stars. After combining those ratings, my final rating is 4.5 stars. If you like dark academia with slight fantasy elements that tackles the themes of colonialism and oppression, definitely read this book. There was room for one more dystopian fiction on my list. This is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. Teenager Lauren Olamina lives with her family in one of the few safe neighborhoods on the outskirts of Los Angeles. Outside the walls of their defended enclave, chaos reigns and only the rich and powerful are safe. When their compound is destroyed in a fire and her family is killed, Lauren is forced out into the dangerous world with a handful of other refugees. Parable of the Sower is Octavia E. Butler's dystopian fiction set in the years 2024 to 2027. The American society has nearly collapsed due to climate change. There's water shortages, inflation, unemployment and housing crisis, and dangerous drugs. The newly elected President Donner promises to make United States strong again, but might just set the country back 100 years. Sound familiar? A lot of people have been reading Octavia E. Butler's book in recent years, and no wonder. First published in 1993, this book is more timely now than at the time of its publication. Butler's predictions about the future are eerily accurate. The story is told in a diary format, with Lauren recording everything she sees and experiences. The format means that the narration happens after the fact. The reader is kept at a distance from what little action the story has, which makes the stakes rather low. In addition, Parable of the Sower is a very introspective read. Lauren mostly writes about her ideas for a new religion she calls Earthseed and her belief in God as change. This gives the book a very slow pace. If this was a more recent young adult dystopian, the main character would naturally lead a rebellion against the corrupted government. But as this book is for adults, Lauren, like any normal teenager, cannot do much. Therefore, not much happens in the first half of the book. The story first feels like it's starting around page 50. That's when Lauren first voices out her desire to leave the safety of the community and look for a better life elsewhere. But she doesn't actually leave until the catastrophe that destroys her community at the midpoint. I found the latter half of the book, where Lauren and other refugees seek out a better future, more interesting than the first half. However, the problem is that during the latter half of the book we meet a completely new cast of characters that we never really get to know very well. This is another drawback of the story being told only from Lauren's perspective. Parable of the Sower is perfect for readers who enjoy slower-paced dystopian fiction with philosophical and theological musings. But I would recommend this book for everyone just for how accurately it predicted the future. The accuracy of the predictions could have given this book 5 stars, but I found the philosophical musings quite boring and repetitive. Toward the end of the book, there was also an unnecessary romance between 18-year-old Lauren and a man older than her father. I found the age gap rather gross. Because of these reasons, I'm deducting half a star and I'm giving this book 4.5 stars in total. Let's finish my best of list with a non-fiction book. That is Tara Westover's memoir, Educated. Her father believed that the government was out to get them and the family prepared for the end of the world. Homeschooled, Tara didn't set foot in a classroom until the age of 17, when she was admitted to Brigham Young University. There, she learned for the first time about important world events like the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement. Memoirs are hard to rate, but this was a clear 5-star read. Educated is about the transformative power of education. It is also a tale of the grief that comes with severing the family ties. With its depictions of abuse and gaslighting, it's by no means an easy read, but definitely a book I'd recommend. Those were my favorite books from 2025. As you can see, my favorite genres were dystopian fiction, historical fiction, and historical fantasy. Let me know in the comments what your favorite book or genre was last year, and I'll see you in my next video.